Blastoise is one of the original starter Pokemon and one of the most popular Pokemon of all time, being most famously piloted by a powerful rival that we all want to beat so badly, Gary or Green. But was it actually great? In this video, we'll be going over Blastoise's history in competitive Pokemon throughout every generation to see if Blastoise's popular reputation holds up in the competitive scene. How great was Blastoise actually? Let's find out. Starting with the first generation. Well, unfortunately, Blastoise didn't have much of anything to offer to Gen 1 trainers, at least if your goal was winning and not running Ash-themed teams. It didn't have much to do in UU either. The tier's greater focus on waters didn't help, as Blastoise couldn't compete with the excellence of Tentacruel, nor others like Dugong, Vaporeon, Gyarados, and even Poliwrath. So when Gen 1 NU was created, Blastoise found its way there, and that turned out to be excellent, as it established itself as the critical defensive backbone of the tier. NU was bombarded with fires as well as waters, and Blastoise stood in their way, most notably holding the metagame together from immediately getting ripped apart by fellow starter Charizard, as well as being able to switch into and threaten out the dangerous Golem. Blastoise's excellent bulk and access to counter also made it superb at switching into and punishing opposing Hyper Beams. Additionally, though Blastoise's primary use was defense, this defense worked particularly because it was not at all shabby on the offensive side. The tier was light on recovery, so anything that switched into its perfectly respectable Surf was not going to be shrugging it off, be it Clefable, Electrode, or Mr. Mime. In fact, since Pokemon taking the surprisingly hefty chunks from Surf was very undesirable, in addition to the fact that nothing was to it KOing Blastoise except for Electrode, which would let it continuously spam set Surfs, as well as its Victory Bell, Dragonair, and Execute Smacking Blizzard, Blastoise most commonly wound up being checked by, well, other Blastoise. Blastoise was so valuable and so difficult to take on that the best answer wound up being to trade down with one's Blastoise. NU wound up shifting dramatically after UU claimed several common Pokemon that Blastoise would face off against: Electrode, Golem, Clefable, and Ninetales, while OU took Victory Bell, and NU had Aerodactyl, Venusaur, Poliwhirl, Poliwrath, and Golduck join their ranks. However, Blastoise continued to excel. It still takes on Charizard, as well as other top-tier Pokemon like Moltres and Aerodactyl, while generally being difficult to switch into and take down as usual. It had the same playstyle more or less, just with different settings. Overall, Blastoise had a successful debut generation. And this would continue into Gen 2. For much of GSC's UU's existence, it was all about Nidoqueen, whose reign over the tier was characterized by its effortlessness of entry and difficulty of safely checking it. Even after Nidoqueen was no longer the unchallenged top Pokemon, it remained a massive threat. It was precisely this that made Blastoise such an excellent Pokemon, for it was one of the best answers to Nidoqueen, and furthermore, it was unique among Nidoqueen checks that it actually outsped it. This was huge because if Hypno or a Slow Twin were in a certain range of health, they were helpless to prevent Nidoqueen from finishing them off. But even a 1 HP Blastoise could rest in Nidoqueen's face and continue checking it, even though Nidoqueen commonly carried Thunder. Blastoise's Sleep Talks, similarly to how Suicune took on Nidoking and OU, ensured that it was either resting again or threatening Nidoqueen in return with Surf. Even Sleep Talk calling Rapid Spin was fine, because Nidoqueen still had to hit a lot of Thunderous to pressure Blastoise, as if the odds of Blastoise's resting or surfing weren't enough in the face of this. With one rest undoing even multiple Thunder hits, there was also the fact that Thunder's accuracy already dipped below 50% on the second consecutive hit, so Nidoqueen had to be very, very lucky to even stand a chance. And as if all that wasn't enough, half of what made Nidoqueen difficult to switch into and pivot around was spikes. If Blastoise removed them, it could fall back on a teammate much more comfortably before coming back to heal up later. Speaking of spin, this was of course Blastoise's superb utility outside of Nidoqueen, generally getting rid of the hazard that everyone was running Quillfish for. Quillfish running Curse meant Blastoise couldn't just sit on it and PP stall spikes would spin, but it wasn't too difficult to wear Quillfish down through other means as it spiked, and then Blastoise threatened the complete undoing of Quillfish's progress with spin. Quillfish wasn't exactly eager to switch into Blastoise and slug it out either, as it would get worn down. So long as Blastoise wasn't engaging in the war of attrition completely solo, which nobody competent would let it do, it was very good at clearing the field of spikes. Sure, sometimes it had to contend with the spin blocking of Haunter, but Surf hit hard, threatening a 2-hit kill, and Haunter wasn't exactly threatening a 2-hit kill in return, so Blastoise was constantly putting pressure on there too. So long as Blastoise kept out of explosion range, switching out if it did dip into explosion range, or if it suspected a Decibond, worked wonders for it. Beyond the Nidoqueen and spikes of it all, Blastoise was also generally excellent at soaking all manner of hits, from Gyarados to Sandslash, while it could also engage in stalemate Stall Wars against Slow Twins and Hypno to protect its more offensive-minded teammates like Scyther. Its spinning capabilities were critical in enabling stalling friendlier teams and slowing the game down so bulkier setup sweepers like Swords Dance Pinsir could find a precise opportunity to set up and go to town. Overall, Blastoise was a crucial figure in Gen 2 UU. But get ready, because this is the generation where Blastoise cements itself fully in the role that it's going to perform repeatedly for a long time. Yes, it was already a bulky water type with Rapid Spin in Gen 2, but Advanced was the generation where the bulky water as a concept really took off, with the new EV system's power leading to waters being particularly prized for their ability to take on all manner of hits, both general physical as well as various fire on the special side, and to respond in kind. Thus, Blastoise now belonged to a new class of Pokemon that it hadn't really been before, with its greatest differentiating factor among its fellow water hit takers being, of course, Rapid Spin, bringing an amazing level of utility to its team far beyond general tanking. This was especially key now that Spikes went up to 3 layers, with Blastoise particularly excelling in how hard it dominated UU's new go-to spiker, Amistar, and in the lack of good spin blockers, Bandit was hardly a threat to Blastoise's faster, hard-hitting surfs. Now Blastoise was more than an anti-Spikes machine. It was generally a difficult wall to take down, given how well it took neutral attacks and how rare major super effective attacks against it were. Hidden Power Grass doesn't count, and the few stab Thunderbolts out there generally weren't too comfortable taking surfs, to say nothing of how much easier they were to answer when Blastoise's teammates didn't have to contend with Spikes. For instance, Special Defense Heavy Kangaskhan was only okay into Manectric with Spikes down, but without Spikes, it was as solid as you got. It helped that Blastoise also slotted Earthquake into its moveset quite often, as it prevented top-tier threat Swords Dance Tentacruel from using it as setup fodder. In fact, Blastoise's physical defense was so good that even +2 Sludge Bombs didn't particularly terrify it, considering how well it was damaging Tentacruel in return. This also allowed it to stay in against crucial targets like Scyther and Kangaskhan, which was major in getting that all-important spin-off or simply damaging them, as Blastoise did quite well. The fact Blastoise was so effective at countering other threats like Aggron and Gligar further added to just how much value it was bringing its team on a game-to-game basis. Blastoise was a fixture on Gen 3 UU. And speaking of hazard control, with the omnipresence of Stealth Rock, Blastoise's Rapid Spin became more essential than ever before, both for general purposes on balanced teams that like to switch around, as well as the norm in UU, and in support of Pokemon like notable Stealth Rock weaks, Scyther and Moltres. Blastoise was generally not a thrilling Pokemon, and get ready, because there's a lot more of this coming. It was a good spinner, as it enabled threatening teammates, especially those that were Stealth Rock weak, and it was a good counter to several big threats. Of course, just because the generalities remain the same, does not mean the details aren't interesting. Blastoise's spinning was excellent, not just because it found a ton of opportunities against many common offensive and defensive Pokemon like Azumarill and Milotic, and because it countered common stealth rockers like Rhyperior and Donphan beautifully, but also because it was good at sticking around and outlasting Ghosts, especially if it slotted in Protect for extra leftovers. Even a stray Rotom Thunderbolt wasn't going to put it out of commission, so it could slug it out with either it or Mismagius if needed, although it enjoyed Pursuit support to make the job easier, whether from Houndoom or Spiritomb, the latter being another ghost that Blastoise often found itself fighting through. Of course, Blastoise could also ensure the spin against a ghost type by using Foresight, though this couldn't be over-relied on as certain stall teams began employing a dual ghost strategy to shut that down. Instead, it could always rely on racking up hazard damage of its own with Roar, which also helped it against irritating Pokemon like Sub-Roost Moltres or various Calm Minders looking to set up on it. Blastoise was especially key on Hail teams when those were running wild in the tier, beautifully enabling Walrein to come in at full health and dominate longevity lacking offenses. Blastoise's lack of recovery meant it wasn't to be relied on as a permanent wall, but it was also quite adept at taking on several late game threats like Dragon Dance Altaria and Rock Polish Rhyperior, packing the same Ice Beam for the former that it was also used to dissuade Venusaur from getting too comfortable switching in, should it not need to get a spin-off. Blastoise was generally not a flashy Pokemon, but it was one of the most important for so many UU teams from offense to balance to stall. Blastoise did have some flash, though very rarely. It could employ a Choice Scarf set, whose fast Water Stab and Ice Beam let it cut through many fragile offense teams late game. And the fast spin had all sorts of utility in situations where a slower Blastoise would be denied. You have a Moltres at 49%, rocks up, and a slower Blastoise against a last mon spec Sceptile, you better hope Leaf Storm misses or you lose. With Scarf Blastoise though, you get that spin off and you're good to go. Of course, that is assuming Sceptile isn't in range to get KO'd by Ice Beam. You get the picture. The most fun part of Scarf Blastoise was that the initial surprise turn, not just because of the speed, but because it could pretend to be Kyogre and use Water Spout for its stab. Blastoise Blastoise's fun side didn't end there either. Speaking of pretending to be another water, it even had the slightest of niches in OU by pretending to be a combination of Empoleon and Starmie. Empoleon was a great lead for finishing off Focus Sash leads that it would leave at 1 HP with Aqua Jet's priority, while Starmie was excellent for denying such leads that the Stealth Rock user had dedicated themselves to. Blastoise could theoretically combine the Aqua Jet and the Rapid Spin. The problem was, of course, that it wasn't nearly as strong as Empoleon. Sure, neither was Starmie, but it was much faster, which made it a much better spinner and made it more threatening. Still, as far as gimmicky OU leads go, Blastoise wasn't the worst thing you could use, and it was probably the absolute worst thing for an Aerodactyl lead to face. Overall, Blastoise had a great Generation 4. And again, it continued, as Blastoise technically saw the slightest of OU niches with Rain Dish, giving it amazing recovery under Politoed's permanent rain. Why use it over Tentacruel? Well, Blastoise wasn't weak to ground, letting it take on OU threats like Garchomp better. Of course, this wasn't nearly enough to seriously justify it in a tournament setting, but it had to be acknowledged. Blastoise returned to UU, impressively withstanding the onslaught of power creep that had rendered the tier evocative of the previous generation's OU, and proceeded to do the exact same thing as it had before. It was key in taking the frightening firepower of Victini and Darmanitan. It was superb at taking on Stealth Rock Rhyperior again, and also didn't make things easy for the newly popular Rocker Nidoqueen. And it was generally difficult for popular Pokemon like Flygon and Heracross to KO, which let it both get spins off against a vast majority of the meta, difficult to stop by offensive pressure alone, as well as threatening them meaningfully in return. Blastoise was also solid at pivoting around the frightening Kingdra, especially since its phasing tool now didn't have to be Roar. It could also opt for Dragon Tail, which wasn't just nice for chip damage against Kingdra and Flygon, but for how it couldn't be stopped by Taunt, which was particularly helpful at forcing out Stallbreaker Mew. Furthermore, Blastoise now boasted a new Water Stab in Scald. The burns are now freely distributed, making it even more difficult to switch into. Forget trying to take it on with, say, Pharisee. Even if the switch-in was Natural Cure, Roserade, or Shaman, they still wouldn't appreciate the chip damage, to say nothing of how they did not deter Blastoise's primary purpose, Rapid Spin. Speaking of, Blastoise's spins were useful as ever in enabling the many excellent Stealth Rock weeks in the tier, like Togekiss, and when in the tier, Abomasnow. It was also particularly helpful for those that like to spam U-turn, like Zapdos, Crobat, the aforementioned Victini, and Darmanitan. Between Scald and its good bulk, it was quite adept at going toe-to-toe with Cofagrigus, though it could get worn down in the process. So a new set emerged, Offensive Blastoise, with fully invested Hydro Pumps. Blastoise blasted through standard max HP Cofagrigus much more easily, with solid odds to 2-hit KO cleanly through leftovers, always with Stealth Rock and its speed investment that allowed it to find more opportunities to pull the spin off. The special attack investment had other benefits too. Ice Beam struck Zapdos, Roserade, and Shaman much harder, and when this set was really being used on Hail teams, Blastoise could unleash blizzards that really smashed them. Whether offensive or defensive, it was a tremendously consistent stabilizing Pokemon. And so for the third consecutive generation, Blastoise and its Rapid Spin were staples of UU. Unfortunately for Blastoise, its shell is mostly dead weight in a doubles format. Blastoise's natural defenses simply aren't strong enough to allow it to reliably set up Shell Smash, staring down the double barrel of two potential attackers, and so its initial VGC career was spent among the scores of other single sweepers who found themselves out of work in a novel format. Some very enterprising players did manage to give Blastoise some gig work in 5th gen VGC, including Mike Omega Donut Selesky's top 16 finish at the 2013 UK Nationals, but perhaps the best summation of Blastoise's viability comes from Sam Dr. Fidget Harzma, who got 7th place at the Fort Wayne Regionals, which he accomplished with a team consisting of Crobat, Mamoswine, Virizion, Houndoom, and Cofagrigus. If that team sounds like a joke gone wrong to you, that's because it was. You see, Sam put the team together on a dare from his friend Chalky Horestein to make a functional team consisting of Chalky's favorite Pokemon. So Blastoise's best performance of Gen 5 VGC wasn't due to its strengths. It was actually an explicit recognition of just how bad it was. Nevertheless, Sam made it work, leveraging one of the few top-tier VGC tools that Blastoise can use, Fake Out. In keeping with the team's unconventional origins, he ran physical max attack Blastoise to take advantage of his Crobat's Screech, doling out waterfalls and ice punches to unsuspecting opponents. The only person more surprised the team worked than those competitors was Sam himself, and that says everything there is to say about Blastoise's viability in these Gen 5 days. But then Blastoise received a Mega Form transformed with the release of Generation 6, and it was quite the departure from the defensive focus that had been its mainstay throughout its career up until this point. Despite hefty improvements to its bulk, it was offensively focused, receiving a massive plus 50 to its base special attack. Not only that, it received Mega Launcher as an ability, giving a 50% boost to Pulse moves, effectively gaining stab on the likes of Water Pulse, which was now as strong as the nerf Surf, but had a 20% chance to confuse, as well as Aura Sphere and what would become one of the most spammed attacks, Dark Pulse, a move that, like its cousin Shadow Ball, would become especially prominent for how it enjoyed the nerf to a no longer resistant Steel type. It didn't quite pack the profile for OU, which liked its offensive waters much faster, but it immediately established itself as a top tier Pokemon in XYUU. Mega Blastoise had an excellent set of traits. It had no problem shattering common defensive cores with its powerful attacks. Its Dark Pulse cleaved through the Mew and Slowbro that were common in early UU. In the event that you did manage to stave off its offensive onslaught with Florges, no problem. That's where Rapid Spin came in. Spin was especially valuable now that everyone was enamored with the Fog, because this way you could clear hazards without ridding yourself of your own. Its pseudo-stab Dark Pulse also ensured spin blocking attempts from Frostlass would be short-lived, while even the Dark Neutral Sableye struggled to not collapse under the pressure from its attacks. In addition to putting immense pressure on teams' defensive cores and hazard maintenance alike, Mega Blastoise was preferred over its non-Mega water spinning competition, Starmie, because although Mega competition was fierce in an Aerodactyl metagame, Megastoise had the hit-taking capability that made it much more difficult to nullify the effects of its wall breaking and spinning alike, thanks to both its much better bulk and its lack of a pursuit weakness that meant it wasn't at all afraid of Scarf Crocodile and Mega Aerodactyl itself. However, things changed once Oraz came around. It wasn't just that the metagame became more power crept, it was an accumulation of many other factors which all shared a general disregard for Megastoice's presence. It was still decent, but only just, and struggled to make its impact felt, especially since the Mega competition was now far more stringent than just Aerodactyl. It now had to contend with Swampert, Sharpedo, and Sceptile as well. Then it was the way the meta shifted. First, Sand teams took advantage of its lack of longevity and unspectacular speed to hold it off with Roserade, en route to bowling it over with a Stoutland sweep. Then set up spam hyper offense featuring monsters like Infernape and Salamence would run it over even quicker. Salamence was eventually banned, but Megastoise just couldn't find its footing, especially as it wasn't long until Entei and its brutal Sacred Fire took over the tier. A water so low on longevity was not something you wanted to throw into Entei, especially if said water didn't offer some sort of late game sweeping prowess as compensation, and it took up your Mega slot to boot. Anti-Entei options were too sparse to afford such luxuries. The meta adapted to Entei, but then it was the insanely broken Conkeldurr taking over the tier, and Megastoise didn't have much to contribute in the effort to defend against it either. The metagame settled into a balanced state post-Conk ban, with the exception of Disruptive Slurpuff Hyper Offense Cheese that also got the cake canned, and Megastoise didn't really fit in either. It wasn't a longevity-focused scalding water type like Seismitoad, Swampert, Suicune, Slowking, Tentacruel, or Empoleon, but it didn't offer a sweeping option for the late game just like Gyarados or Mega Sharpedo. It was an awkward in-between, especially since Mega Aerodactyl was still dominating the tier. Megastoise was obviously a fine Pokemon, but difficult to fit, especially since the one way it had around its longevity issues was to run a Rest Talk set, which was decent, but wasn't exactly threatening, since it could only actually attack with Scald, not something you generally look for in a Mega. Base Blastoise wound up in RU this time around, and it did its usual Blastoise thing. It was particularly valued for this because the metagame was centered around balanced teams looking for ways to gain advantages over each other, and the advantage Blastoise provided was being the best spinner in the tier, meaning that its team did not have to rely on Defog for its hazard removal and could instead reap the benefits of not having to deal with hazards while not losing the pressure of their own. For the third generation in a row, Blastoise thrived for its strong matchup into Stealth Rock Rhyperior, while also shutting down another common rocker in Bronzong. With Refresh in its moveset, it didn't fear Toxic at all. That same Refresh also let it dominate the Jellicent and would Toxic itself, allowing Blastoise to find opportunities to rapid spin even against the tier's sturdy Ghost. Toxic and Scald, as always, threatened a great deal of the tier, letting Blastoise pose quite a threat and contribute to its balanced team's onslaught of residual damage. And also, as always, Blastoise's solid bulk let it withstand all manner of hits from many of the tier's threats. Overall, Generation 6 was a major success for the Blastoises. And fortunately for Blastoise, Generation 6 started the long-honored tradition of Game Freak bestowing special treatment upon its favorite children, and it, alongside the rest of the Kanto starters, was handed a nifty new Mega Evolution to catch up to the pace of the youngins in VGC as well. Unfortunately for Blastoise, it's basically the red-headed stepchild of that trio, and while Charizard and Venusaur got handed weather warping damage and the ability to ignore 2 weaknesses, Blastoise got a conditional power boost on some of the more mediocre moves in the format. Now, that's not to say that it's all bad. Mega Launcher allowed Blastoise to finally make use of its wide coverage, boosting moves like Dragon Pulse and Dark Pulse to be actually viable in sniping up opposing dragons or Aegislash. But for the most part, Blastoise was stuck in an awkward middle zone, lacking both the offensive Zard and the bulk of Venusaur, with an ambiguous speed tier that only drove its muddled role home. It was hard to justify using Blastoise for the Mega slot in competition with things like Kangaskhan, Mawile, both Charizards, and even Tyranitar. But maybe the most important change Mega Blastoise made was that it made Blastoise way more fun to play, and for some people, that was enough. Jackson Doherty was the first to give actual shape to his affection for Blastoise, placing top 4 at the 2014 Long Beach Regionals with a Blastoise that combined Sam's utility with the newfound firepower, using Fake Out alongside the 3 attacking moves of Hydro Pump, Dragon Pulse, and finally, Aura Sphere to hit Kangaskhan. Jackson's success inspired another out-of-the-box team builder, Randy R. Inanimate Qua, to give Blastoise a chance, but Randy had a different idea of how to best utilize Blastoise. While clicking Mega Launcher moves to cover every weakness was fun, Blastoise often still struggled to pick up KOs with the same efficiency as other offensive Megas like Charizard. So instead of leaving Blastoise in the messy middle, Randy pushed it all the way to the side of offense, relying on one move, Water Spout. Randy's Blastoise only made use of Mega Launcher for one move, Aura Sphere, which gave it a reasonable matchup against Kangaskhan. His other moves were Protect, Ice Beam, and the main draw of the set, a base 135 special attack Water Spout. In order to ensure Blastoise could unload its cannons, Randy paired it with one of VGC's most notorious Pokemon, Smeargle. His Smeargle packed Fake Out, Dark Void, Follow Me, and King Shield, all moves aimed at stealing turns from the opponent or lowering their stats so Blastoise could remain at full power. Randy's initial draft of this team performed remarkably well, garnering him a silver medal finish at Seattle Regionals and setting the mold for future Blastoise players by focusing on Blastoise's Water Spout. And here's the thing about Randy, he approaches team building a bit different than most players. While the majority of VGC players will switch between a bevy of different teams from tournament to tournament, Randy prefers to hone his skill with one team over the course of the season. In 2014, that team would be Blastoise and Smeargle, which means not only did he achieve top 2 at a regional, he also gave Blastoise top 16 at US Nationals and a 33rd place finish at Worlds. While the other pieces of the team changed slightly around, Blastoise, the turtle itself, remained the same, except for an adjustment to its spread before Nationals, when Randy switched to Timid Blastoise. This Blastoise sacrificed both power and bulk for a bit of extra speed, but when you're running Water Spout, speed is power, and this Blastoise would often find itself outrunning even opposing Kangaskhan. With all that said, Randy wasn't even the most successful Blastoise player of the year. At the US Nationals, Simon Yip placed top 8 with the team that went all in on Turtle Time. Simon packed his team with options entirely designed around letting Blastoise Water Spout, from Follow Me Final Gambit Lucario to Rage Powder Amoonguss to Tailwind Talonflame. Omari Bad Intent Travis also logged a respectable 20th place at Nationals with a non-Water Spout Blastoise, raising Blastoise to the 5th most used Mega at the tournament, only one behind Charizard Y, although both of them were well eclipsed by their big older brother. Because Blastoise was so inconsistent, its most consistent often used it in a dual Mega strategy. Randy used Mega Venusaur at Nationals and Kangaskhan at Worlds. Also at Worlds, Eric Rios placed top 3 in the Seniors division with a Blastoise virtually identical to the set Randy had been running apart from the nature, bolstered by his own Amoonguss and a backup Mega T-Tar. In the Masters division, 2 players other than Randy brought Blastoise. Former world champion Ray Rizzo, who placed 56th, and Enosh Human Shakar, who managed a 12th place finish with his own version of Tailwind Blastoise. Enosh also paired Blastoise with Mega Manectric, and while you wouldn't often see 2 Mega Pokemon come at once, Enosh could play mind games with the unevolved Manectric's Lightning Rod in the back, giving Blastoise one more safety measure needed to launch attacks. Unlike the standalone powerhouses that came to dominate the format, Blastoise was the rare Mega in need of consistent team support and redirection, qualities that made it inherently consistent. Blastoise certainly never competed for the status of a Tier 1 Mega during 2014. Honestly, it wasn't even Tier 2, but damn wasn't it fun to launch a Water Spout to wash the enemy away. Unfortunately for Blastoise, those tiers became even more divided with the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which introduced a new host of Mega competition. Mega Salamence and Metagross pushed every other Mega down in turn, and Blastoise found its already small niche shrinking further. It even had a new Water-type starter Mega to compete with, and unlike Blastoise, Swampert could actually make use of the rain outside of some paltry rain dish recovery. A scant few players managed to use it to some success, such as Joshua Pethick at Perth Regionals and Jim Sullivan in Melbourne, but for the most part, Blastoise was nowhere to be seen. That is until Worlds, where Japanese player Koki Sakurai notched a top 16 finish by pairing it with yet another new Mega, in this case Gardevoir. Blastoise closed out the generation as the definitive worst Kanto starter in VGC, a title it wouldn't shirk anytime soon. Mega Blastoise's blend of wall breaking and rapid spin support was appreciated in Gen 7 UU, but it was far from a necessity, as the power creep of the tier had largely eclipsed it, Mega and non-Mega alike, though the Mega factor was particularly salient given that now it had to compete with not just old faces like Aerodactyl and Sharpedo, but new tier-defining beasts like Altaria, Slowbro, and Manectric, all of which matched up way better into the metagame that was dominated by Latias, Scizor, Hydreigon, Terraquake, and Primarina than Mega Blastoise ever could. So it dropped to Ryu, but that was just fine, because there it became one of the best, most defining forces in the tier. With just one set, it was the Ryu metagame's hazard control, as well as its most threatening wall breakers, and as such, fit onto many an offensive team beautifully, assisted further by the wide range of top threats that it checked, like Metagross and Doublade. Funnily enough, Megastoise didn't even use Water Stab. Its Mega Launcher fueled Pseudo Stabs in Dark Pulse and Aura Sphere were its main weapons to go alongside Spin and Ice Beam, and they packed superb power and coverage between them. This variant, with max special attack and speed, was so good, so essential to the functioning of itself and by extension the teams it was used on, that it just about never bothered with anything else. You were never spin blocking a Pokemon that fired off such vicious Dark Pulses, so Mega Blastoise didn't have much trouble pulling spins off, especially since it smacked around the tier's hazard setter something fierce, and its excellent defensive profile gave it plenty of opportunity. It wasn't only used on teams with Stealth Rock weeks, but boy did those squads anchoring on major threats that were mostly held back by the sneaky pebbles like Ninetales, Noivern, and Swellow appreciated Blastoise's help to find their greatest level of consistency. As such, Mega Blastoise was consistently atop the usage stats, finding success non-stop in high-level play. If it didn't need to spin, all the better, as switching into it was a distinctly unpleasant proposition if you didn't pack Florges or Milotic. Even the specially tanky Roserade and Virizion didn't enjoy its Ice Beams, while Special Walls, Registeel, and Snorlax viciously protested the prospect of eating its Aura Spheres. In Gen 7 RU, Mega Blastoise didn't struggle from Mega competition. It was the Mega competition, the tier's best Mega by a country mile. It was consistently one of RU's very best. Meanwhile, base Blastoise followed the trend and dropped to NU this time around, where it did, well, Blastoise things. It was as unflashy as it was consistent. It took on the tier's best Stealth Rocker Steelix with aplomb, as well as also handling Druddigon and not Rhyperior this time, but Rhydon. Its hit-taking and status refreshing also let it thrive against offensive teams alike, whether it was checking the fires in Delphox and Incineroar, the latter thanks to the hefty speed EVs that it invested in to let it check the Swords Dance variant, or whether it was happy to exchange status with Slowking or Vaporeon, knowing that it would heal it off. Being able to switch in and absorb Scald was also wonderful utility for its team. The same applied to Paralysis from Druddigon's Glare. Blastoise doing Blastoise was generally a very good thing, and Gen 7 was no exception, as Mega and Base alike racked up another series of successes. Gen 7 was almost worse for Blastoise's VGC career than Gen 5. Despite retaining access to its Mega Evolution, Blastoise now found itself facing down additional problems in the form of Kartana and Tapu Koko, as well as a stiff competitor for a water slot in Tapu Fini. When Blastoise did show up, it was almost invariably on Tailwind offense. While many players opted for Kartana, Sam Odell used a Hawlucha to set a favorable climate en route to his 4th place finish at Dallas Regionals, the only top 8 Blastoise would muster for all of Sun and Moon. But in the next generation, Blastoise finally got a move in Gen 8 that fans had been clamoring for since Generation 5, since it has, you know, a shell. Yes, it finally got Shell Smash, and went to NU, where it spent quite some time as the player base rocked back and forth on whether or not it was broken. It seems like a hilarious idea, given the outrageousness of Shell Smash on an actually good Pokemon like Blastoise, as opposed to the usually flawed bunch of hooligans the move was given to, and all the way down in NU, but the anti-ban crowd certainly made some cogent points. Yes, Blastoise was exactly as terrifying as you'd expect, when bearing down on an arguably ill-equipped NU tier with double speed and special attack, especially since its great natural bulk meant it wasn't going to be easily revenge killed even with Smash's lowered defenses, to say nothing of the tier's general dearth of threatening priority and complete lack of Scarfers capable of outrunning it at +2. Of course, that great bulk alongside the eternal reliability of pure water typing meant it was never going to have a difficult time finding opportunities to boost. As such, it was much scarier than, say, Amistar, despite not being as outright powerful. It was a vicious game ender, a fast one-hit KO machine that didn't even have the decency to be frail, and it relentlessly took advantage of tier staples like Mudsdale, Stakataka, and Talonflame. Having said that, it did have some very decent checks in bulky waters, much like it had been for so long. Think the likes of Vaporeon and Mantine, as Gen 8's removal of hidden power meant that Blastoise couldn't just pop them with HP Electric. However, that was exactly the issue. Blastoise could kind of sit on these Pokemon because they didn't actually threaten it in return without compromising their movesets against the metagame. Haze was not a move that would get much damage against Blastoise's targets, of which there were many of them to take on. So therein lay the dilemma. It wasn't a question of if Blastoise could be dealt with, but whether it should be dealt with. Whether it was reasonable to allow the burden of a sweeper that was this threatening this immediately. After several years of such conflicted wrangling, hyper offense teams were starting to become overbearing. A cascading chain of sweepers is one thing, but such a chain enabled by this brutal threat becomes utterly nightmarish. A late game Blastoise was impossible to stop without a check like Sylveon, Vileplume, or Eldegoss at perfect health, which was a ridiculous and unreasonable demand. As such, Blastoise eventually got the boot, and sadly, it couldn't quite make it in RU, but that was just fine because it had dug a long, slow screw into NU, such that the tier's player base would never forget, capping off another successful generation. Who needs a Mega when it's base Blastoise that actually got the axe? As a bonus, we usually don't mention non-standard formats, but we thought this was too great not to include. In National Dex OU, Mega Blastoise did indeed have access to Shell Smash, and as a result, it got sent to Ubers. Contrary to what you might expect, Blastoise was actually happy to leave Mega Evolutions behind in Sword and Shield. Not because Mega Blastoise was bad, but because G-Max Blastoise was so much better. Gigantamax forms quite literally leveled the playing field between the Kanto trio. While Mega Evolutions had bestowed a tailored ability on each, all three G-Max forms were given a max move with the same functionality, a whopping 1/6 HP residual damage to the opposing team every turn, a side effect that could lift even the most down and out unfortunates into relevance, which brings us to our good friend Blastoise. It wasn't an easy path to relevance for Blastoise, as Charizard and Venusaur were straightforward, both in and out of their max form. Venusaur could function with Sleep Powder, and Charizard could still output tons of damage under Solar Power. What's more, these two were more effective in max form due to the boosting available from their secondary stab moves. Where's Blastoise's second type, huh? Well, for Gen 8, it might as well be normal. Blastoise's niche came credit of 3 normal type supporting moves: Fake Out, Helping Hand, and Yawn. While Blastoise hadn't made use of Fake Out before, Helping Hand and Yawn were 2 moves that had become all the more powerful in a generation of play, often centralized around one big threat on the field. These moves ensured Blastoise could be useful even when it wasn't in full artillery mode itself. Most Blastoise movesets consisted of 1 or 2 of these supporting moves, alongside Blizzard for coverage and Hydro Cannon for its most powerful G-Max cannonades possible. Items were usually either Life Orb for the most damage or Wakan Berry for the sake of longevity. With all that said, Blastoise was still the runt of the proverbial Cantonian litter for the first portion of Sword and Shield. While Charizard scooped up regional trophies and Venusaur terrorized opponents with Sleep Powder, Blastoise only had a few notable victories. Its first appearances came when competitive play was still relegated to online tournaments, specifically at the Players' Cup 4, more specifically still at the European qualifiers for that tournament, where FevZ Ozcon put Blastoise together with Rillaboom, Incineroar, Landorus, Thundurus, and Registeel to win the event and an invitation to the final. 3 separate players ended up using Blastoise in the final bracket, but FevZ snatched the highest placement again at 3rd. Blastoise, for all its power, was still often over-reliant on G-Maxing, and that was a problem, until it wasn't. Blastoise's ticket to the big leagues came in the form of another Pokemon, perhaps the strongest Pokemon in all of Sword and Shield. A Pokemon that eschewed the game's very mechanic and still managed to sit atop the heap. That mon, of course, would be Zacian. You see, Zacian was literally incapable of Dynamaxing, meaning it wanted partners who would always be able to make use of Dynamax. Blastoise, with its respectable bulk and incredible max move, fit that description to a T. While Water Spout had been unreliable, G-Max Cannonade was anything but, guaranteed damage off of one move, allowing Blastoise to finally take use of its even distribution between power, speed, and bulk. While early Blastoise variants could struggle to transition between the support and attacking moves, Zacian provided an easy target for Blastoise to support. It greatly appreciated the continual chip damage provided by Cannonade, enabling the Sword Dog to run through weakened teams and clean up games. Blastoise really came into its own when restricted Pokemon were first allowed in Series 11. Although the singles restricted format was somewhat short-lived, its real moment in the spotlight came in Series 12, when the double restricted format allowed it to thrive as the designated max Pokemon on teams that needed to fill that slot. A team composition quickly popped up that centered around Zacian along with Caloric's Shadow Rider, another restricted Pokemon that, while it could Dynamax, often didn't want to because it meant losing the spread effect of its broken signature move, Astro Barrage. These teams were built with the balanced Fire, Water, Grass core at the center, typically consisting of Blastoise, Rillaboom, and Incineroar, with the last slot often going to one of Regieleki, Thundurus, or Landorus. Those 4 Pokemon were the sturdy backbone of the team, slowly gaining positional advantage so Zacian and Caloric's Shadow could clean house at the end. Blastoise had never been a top-tier Pokemon before. Now it was a familiar sight on one of the most prevalent team compositions. It wasn't the most common way to play Zacian, but it was a notable threat players had to be ready for. Here are just a few of the players who achieved success with this variation of Zacian Caloric's Shadow. Suddenly, Blastoise was in top cuts around the world and the online circuit. Special shoutouts to Francisco Pero, who gave Blastoise its first gold medal by winning the Victory Road to Frankfurt tournament over more than 400 other players. Blastoise wasn't purely seen with Zacian and Caloric's Shadow though. While those offensive mons appreciated the chip of Cannonade, the same went for defensive restricted Pokemon that could sit on the field, tanking damage while the geysers and torrents of Blastoise's move tore through the opponent. That was the strategy that Javier Valdez brought to the European International Championships, where he showed up with a totally unique team using Dialga, Weezing, and Porygon 2, alongside the standard trio of Rillaboom, Zacian, and Blastoise. Javier went undefeated in Friday's Swiss stages before ending the tournament at 6th place, giving Blastoise perhaps its best international placement ever. In addition to Javier, there was one other Blastoise player in the top 16, another in top 32, and 3 more in the top 64. And while those might seem like mediocre numbers to any other Pokemon, for Blastoise it was a marked improvement from its old days riding the bench. At the end of the day, Blastoise is and always has been the worst Kanto starter in VGC. It makes up for that with its singles performance, and as a Kanto starter, the future is uncertain. It's unlikely Game Freak's suddenly going to decide Blastoise is the favorite kid over Charizard, but who knows, maybe the next bit of special treatment combines just right, and we finally see the day Blastoise is on top. And with the end of Gen 8, we get to Generation 9. Shell Smash Blastoise returned with a vengeance. Vengeance by the name of Terastallization, which blasted it up a tier from NU to RU. No longer would it engage in silly extended stalemates or outright lose against fellow waters that it lacked the covers to break through. No, now it simply had to Terra Electric and watch as it Terra blasted the opposing Empoleon into oblivion. This was an incredibly common sight. It's not like you could stop Blastoise from setting up, not with how easily it took on defensive staples like Hippowdon, Slowbro, and Jirachi. And it's not like you could simply go to one of your many other Blastoise counters either. Even defensive Terra wasn't necessarily going to save Empoleon. Blastoise simply blasted it apart, as well as crushing other water types. As always, Blastoise's stellar bulk also meant even powerful priority like Bisharp's Sucker Punch wasn't going to be enough to save you. That wasn't all it did either. Terra Electric also gave it a very handy immunity to paralysis and let it set up on would-be super effective electric moves. Oh, and the best part was that this was just the beginning of the fun, as it was certainly not limited to Terra Electric. Terra Ground would also blow Empoleon apart and protect it from Thunder Waves, while also crushing would-be answers in Hisuian Goodra and Alolan Muck. In the case that wasn't out there enough for you, Blastoise really demonstrated its ability to do whatever it wanted by running Terra fighting to, yes, beat Empoleon, but also shred Umbreon. Once again, Shell Smash Blastoise was the centerpiece of hyper offense teams in a metagame overrun by them, largely owing to the difficulty in answering it, at least reasonably. It wasn't just Blastoise that had the player base on the verge of a nervous breakdown either. It was greatly assisted by, just as it greatly assisted them itself, Revavroom, Mousehold, Armarouge, and Yanmega. The community wondered, where do you even start when there are so many tier destroyers of this level? To their credit, they knew that they didn't just have to start somewhere, they also knew how to pick the starting point. Scary though the others were, Blastoise was the most frightening late game cleaner of the bunch, and as such, it was chosen to be thrown on the chopping block. There was little resistance, as not only did the player base detest how ruthless it was in finishing games off, it was also the lowest impact ban. It didn't offer much to the tier beyond its brutal sweeping capabilities. It resoundingly received the ban hammer, and hyper offense was sufficiently nerfed. This marked a career high for Blastoise, so even though it hasn't been able to leave much of an impact on UU, that's the 9th generation in a row that Blastoise has found success. And now we can finally answer the question, so how great was Blastoise actually? Well, Blastoise is in many ways the quintessential bulky water type. It doesn't have reliable recovery, but its pure water typing and great hit taking affords it a place time and time again, especially as it has become synonymous with Rapid Spin ever since Generation 2. It has had some variation, but by and large for most of its career, it has performed the same role over and over again. It tanks the hits from some big hitters, often fire and ground types, and it spins those pesky hazards away. It's no pure utility blob either. It dishes the hits back out just fine too. From Gen 1 NU to 4 consecutive stints in UU to the rejuvenation of its Mega as its base form that still focused on spinning in addition to its new hard-hitting slant, it was very much in the same vein. But the more aggressive direction picked up by its Mega was continued by its access to Shell Smash that it finally gained in Gen 8, which led to it to be banned from NU. Then with the help of Terastallization, it did the same in Generation 9's RU, marking new success for it. And in VGC, honestly Blastoise wasn't that good, but every time it got a Game Freak present, it got used. And it even got used to the highest echelon along with its fellow starters once it received the G-Max form. Blastoise has had a great career, and it's done so without overt Game Freak favoritism. Let's be real, the other two are much better, and it often gets hand-me-down presents. But despite that, it's always made it work. So maybe all those kids in the 90s who picked Squirtle knew what was up after all. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.